Good evening, and thank you for joining us for tonight's community meeting with Los Alamos National Laboratory Director Thom Mason. I'm Carmelina Hart with the lab's communications team, and I will be your moderator for this evening's event. Thom Mason has been LANL's director since 2018. Tonight, he'll recap the lab's 2025 activities, including significant mission-related accomplishments and notable community-focused initiatives. He will also provide a brief preview of the year ahead and discuss some of the main challenges and opportunities for the laboratory in 2026. At the end of the presentation, Thom will also take questions which you've been sending in for the past few days. And if you have a question that you'd like to submit and send tonight, please email us. The address is asklanl@lanl.gov. But first, let's check in with Thom for an update. Thom.
Well, thanks, Carmelina. And what I wanted to do was just spend a little bit of time kind of reviewing some things that have been happening over the course of the year. It's been a very busy time for us. We got a lot done. You can see kind of a collage here of images that capture some of those moments. Of course, we've got a new administration, and the new Secretary of Energy, then new Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, made sure that his first stop at a DOE lab was at Los Alamos, since this is really where it all began. And he came to visit us shortly after he was confirmed, actually. And we had a visit from the Deputy Secretary, James Danley, who's shown cutting a ribbon at a new facility that we dedicated called the Flight Integration Testing Laboratory, which is a new facility where we'll be doing a lot of the testing of components that make up our deterrent, sort of shaking them in different sort of ways and subjecting them to the kind of environments they would experience to make sure they perform as designed. And so we completed that facility ahead of schedule and under budget, and the Deputy Secretary was part of the group that celebrated that accomplishment. Other areas of activity, of course, we have a lot going on in our plutonium facility, PF4. You can see kind of in the middle an image of the removal of one of the legacy glove boxes that date back to when the facility was first commissioned and brought into operation in the late 70s and early 80s. And we've been going through a process of pulling out those older glove boxes in order to prepare the space for new state-of-the-art equipment that's going in its place. We had some exciting developments in high-performance computing and artificial intelligence. The Venado supercomputer that we took delivery of about 2 years ago has been moved into our classified environment, and we deployed on that system the ChatGPT advanced reasoning models from OpenAI so that we could use them for our national security missions. And it turns out that that machine was very well suited to that sort of work because it has some of those prized NVIDIA GPUs that are used for doing the training and inference for artificial intelligence, in addition to really wonderful capabilities for modeling and simulation, which is the sort of traditional work that we've done in areas like biology. You can see some of an image of a piece of a chromosome there. And then later in the year, actually at the beginning of October, we announced the replacements for our current generation of supercomputers. So Venado will be replaced by a machine called Vision. And its sort of sister machine is a larger machine called Mission that will be used for our core deterrence mission work, both modeling and simulation and artificial intelligence. These are kind of next generation versions of the architecture that we have in Venado, so they also feature NVIDIA chips. HPE is the company that does the integration, builds them into the systems, and we awarded that contract at the beginning of October. And so we'll be looking forward late next year, early the year after, earlier in 2027, to starting to take advantage of the really tremendous capabilities those computers will have. So there's been a lot going on, and those are just a few highlights. Obviously, we've got a new administration, so there's new leadership in Washington that has been coming into their roles and getting to know the lab and getting to know the organization. In addition to Secretary Wright and Deputy Secretary Danley, we have new NNSA Administrator Brandon Williams and his deputy Scott Papano. Matt Napoli is the head of the Nonproliferation Program, which is one of the important missions we do in the area of nonproliferation and arms control. And Dario Gil is the Undersecretary for Science, who's a key player in a recently announced AI initiative that I'll talk a little bit more about. We're still awaiting some confirmations, and so the NA-10, as it's called, the lead for the weapons program is Dave Beck, who actually spent time at Los Alamos earlier in his career. He's awaiting confirmation. Vote should be fairly soon, and that'll kind of round out the team that will be overseeing much of the work that we do at Los Alamos. So change there in terms of NNSA leadership. I would say the support for our mission is bipartisan. It has been consistent, as we've seen changes in administration from Obama to the first Trump administration to Biden, now to the second Trump administration. And I think the reason for that consistent support is the kind of volatile geopolitical environment that we find ourselves in. Unfortunately, the world is a kind of dangerous place at the moment, and whether it's in the Middle East or the South China Sea or in Europe with the conflict with Russia and the Ukraine, national security is very front of mind for our leaders in Washington, and that means that the support that we need to do our work has been strong through all of those political changes, and certainly I see already with the new administration a continuation and in fact probably even growth in that support and emphasis on the importance of what we do. In terms of some significant accomplishments across the mission areas of the lab, I mentioned already there's a lot going on in artificial intelligence. We have collaborations with NVIDIA in terms of the hardware, with OpenAI in terms of their models, and really the goal there is to harness the power of what is really the next evolution of high-performance computing, something the lab has done since computers were people in the 40s, and apply it to our national security, science and technology. A big development on that front was the recent announcement of something that's being called the Genesis mission. An executive order signed by the president identifies the Department of Energy as really a lead agency in the government's efforts to harness the power of artificial intelligence. And Dario Gil, who I mentioned is the Undersecretary of Science, will be taking a lead role in that. But the National Nuclear Security Administration, NNSA, plays an important component because it's in our mission area that linkage between artificial intelligence and national security becomes real. So I think more to follow there in terms of fleshing that out. Obviously, there's a budget that's in preparation that we'll find out more about when it's released early in the new year. That'll begin to put a little bit more substance behind the announcement. But there's already funding in place because of the HR 1, as it's called, the bill that passed in the summer, provided some initial appropriations so we could get started on those important activities. We've delivered some custom instruments for NASA's new IMAP probe, which is now launched and in fact taking data, and it's moving at pretty high speed towards the sun because its role is to look at solar winds and solar flares, and that's what that instrumentation that we delivered to the Jet Propulsion Lab that's run by Johns Hopkins, who is integrating it into that probe prior to launch. So we'll be watching as that data begins to come back now that it's up and running. One of the things that the lab does is something called the Offsite Source Recovery Program that goes around the country, indeed around the world, collecting from hospitals and universities and industrial facilities radiation sources that are no longer needed, so that they're not a hazard and there's no risk that they could be used in some malevolent way in a dirty bomb or something. We want to make sure that once these things have been replaced by alternatives, that they're collected in a safe way. And over 900 of these orphan sources were collected over the course of the last year. One big thing that got started this year after a lengthy environmental assessment process was the Electric Power Capacity Upgrade Project. This is actually a key component of enabling the high-performance computing and artificial intelligence needs of the future. We were becoming limited by the amount of power that's available in Los Alamos, and that entails not just a new distribution line from Santa Fe up to Los Alamos, which was the subject of a lot of public discussion, but also the distribution system for that electricity around the lab, which is aging and in need of replacement. So that's a really important development for our future missions. Another thing that attracted a lot of interest locally was the so-called FATWACS. FATWACS is one of those acronyms. What it means, or what it stands for, is Flanged Tritium Waste Containers. And these, as the name implies, are actually containers of waste that we've wanted to dispose of. But in order to ship them, we have to verify that they're not pressurized. The decay of the tritium has the potential to pressurize the containers, and that means that you can't ship them over public roads. So we had to verify that these containers were safe to ship. And that was done. It was completed safely. In fact, all of them now have been shipped to their final disposal site. And there was a minuscule release of radiation associated with that. In fact, in the time that you've spent listening to me since I started speaking, you will have received more radiation from the air you breathe and the room you're in than anyone in northern New Mexico would have received from that venting operation of the FATWACS. We've been doing a lot of work in what we call the Pajarito Corridor. This is the portion of the lab where our plutonium facility, PF4, is located. And of course, I mentioned already glove boxes going in and out of PF4, but in fact, there's a larger investment in modernizing the infrastructure in the Pajarito Corridor to support that, with things like office buildings and parking spaces and the sort of blocking and tackling of infrastructure that you need to make sure that everything is operating smoothly in the PF4 facility. With regard to pit production, we've been ramping up the operations in the facility. About a year ago, we went from working 10 hours a day, 4 days a week, to 24 hours a day, 4 days a week, 24/4 shift. So doubling the number of productive hours available in the plant. And then in the spring, we ramped up further to 24/7 operations, and seven days a week, 24 hours a day. Not full-on operations all 24 hours. We obviously do more during the day. There's more people there. There's more things that we can get done, but we need the extra time just because of the large volume of work we have upgrading the infrastructure, improving the facility to make sure it's fit for purpose for the long haul. It's sort of a midlife refit, if you will, and also continuing production. We met all of our goals for pit production. We no longer talk about the exact number of pits that we make because we're now making what are called war reserve pits. They meet all the requirements for the deterrent, and since the number of weapons is classified, we can no longer tell you how many pits we made. When we were doing the development work, we were able to be pretty transparent and say this year we made 5 or 7 or whatever, but I can say that we're meeting our production goals. Another noteworthy accomplishment was the completion of the last production unit of the B-6112, which was a life extension program. The B-6112 is the gravity bomb that actually is not just part of the U.S. deterrent, it's part of the NATO deterrent. So there's sharing arrangements with other NATO allies that gives them confidence that what's happening in the Ukraine won't spread into the NATO countries. And in addition to that last production unit of the B-6112, we sort of didn't miss a beat in shifting gears to focus on the B-6113 and achieved the first production unit at Pantex about a year ahead of schedule. So I think oftentimes people will hear about challenges that we have and how hard it is to reconstitute pit production, which was something that we got out of for a long time. But sometimes forgotten in that is the fact that we are doing a lot of work to modernize our deterrent to make sure it's fit for purpose and causing our adversaries to think hard before they undertake an adventure that would threaten the U.S. You can see actually a picture of that B-6113 first production unit at Pantex, where the secretary was the one who affixed the stamp to it that sort of codified the fact that it met all the requirements of that system. And the famous FATWAC is the thing up in the upper right-hand corner. That's actually what one of those flanged tritium waste containers looks like. So those are just a few highlights of things that we got done. In terms of the budget for the lab, of course, we had to manage our way through the lapse in appropriations when Congress did not complete even a continuing resolution at the end of the fiscal year, at the end of September. We were at the lab fortunately able to avoid any furloughs and other impacts to the workforce because we finished the year with funds on hand that were sufficient to get us through to the point in time when a continuing resolution was put in place that carries us through to January. Some of the federal workforce unfortunately were furloughed. There were a small number who were called in to make sure that the lab could continue operations. So that meant that there were no significant impacts in terms of our important mission work, although to be honest, it's the kind of disruption that we could really do without. So hopefully we'll get a full budget passed before the end of January. And of course, that means we don't know precisely what the funding will be for 2026, even though we're partway into that fiscal year that begin October 1st. But based on the budget request, you can sort of see in the graph on the right that we would anticipate the funding will be increasing. It kind of leveled off for 2 years in 24 and 25 because there was a budget agreement that kind of capped the budget. That's now expired, and our mission drivers are causing us to get back on a growth trajectory. That means that our procurements are projected to increase. We awarded about $1.8 billion in FY25, and over $750 million of that was with New Mexico businesses, and almost $400 million with small businesses. So that's a significant component above and beyond the salaries of the people who work at the lab that has an impact throughout our region, throughout our state. So we anticipate that when the budget is passed in 2026, that we'll be in a strong position. We have some areas where we're continuing to hire as we ramp up activities according to our plans, and you can see the procurements will also be going up again once we get that budget appropriated. In terms of activities that we've been doing in the region to support our communities, we kind of, it's not a bumper sticker, it's a sticker you can put on your laptop that says "Be a Force for Good." We want to be a valued and appreciated member of the communities in which we live, as well as where we work. And we do this through a number of different ways. There's been a large investment in workforce development. There's a federal program that supports those efforts in colleges and universities around us. Over 1,100 students have been impacted from that $18 million investment, getting training in programs that prepare them for the important work that we have, particularly focused on the PIT mission. That's the basis for that federal funding behind that program. We've instituted 2 new mentor-protege agreements with regional small businesses. This is a way that the lab can work with smaller companies that are, eager to find ways that they can get subcontracts with the lab, but in some cases may be sufficiently small that they need some coaching in order how to do that. I mean, we are a federal entity, and we have pretty stringent requirements that must be met in order to contract with us, and that can be a big hurdle for a small business that's just getting started. And so the mentor-protege arrangement is a way where we can essentially coach small businesses in how to meet those requirements, and then when they graduate from the program, they're now able to compete, not just for Los Alamos contracts, but for other government contracts, really anywhere in the country. One of the things that's been very helpful and beneficial for our growth is something that the state of New Mexico did with the Advanced Manufacturing Tax Credit Program. This was designed to incentivize job creation in manufacturing, in sort of more high-tech manufacturing. And that's actually what we do in the PF4 facility. So these jobs that we've been filling through the pipeline programs with colleges and universities are exactly the kind of high-paying, high-quality jobs that the state was seeking to incentivize with that tax credit program, and it's been instrumental in creating over 200 jobs just within the last year. The road improvements at New Mexico State Road 4 and the truck route intersection have been completed. This was facilitated through a cooperative arrangement between the National Nuclear Security Administration, the New Mexico Department of Transportation, Los Alamos County. It's made a big difference in terms of the flow of traffic. It really improved a pretty nasty bottleneck that had a lot of backed up traffic at the start of the day and at the end of the day. We still have challenges, I think, in terms of the traffic and traffic safety. We're very focused on. And the thing that we have control over is traffic safety on our site, and we are monitoring that, and we're taking action, and we're actually seeing steady and significant improvements as a result of that intervention. And of course, it's in the surrounding communities. We work with local law enforcement, and they've stepped up their enforcement as well. So things are improving, although I think there's still work to be done there. In terms of the pipeline programs, this has been something we've been working at for a couple of years, but I think we've now reached the point where we're seeing enough people graduating from these programs moving into permanent full-time jobs at the lab that we can really say that this has been successful. And in fact, we're sufficiently encouraged that we're now exploring other areas where we have, specific needs for tailored education and training in areas that are important to the lab, and working with the local higher education institutions to kind of create those programs so that we don't have to look outside the region to fill those jobs. And so it's a really, I think, a powerful combination wherein you've got the state's incentives designed to sort of facilitate the creation of these advanced manufacturing jobs, and then the training programs in higher education that are making sure that students from northern New Mexico have the skills they need to become full-time staff employed in those roles. So with that, I think we're going to turn to some questions now.
Yeah, thank you, Tom, for that update. Time now to turn to questions from our surrounding community members. If you'd like to ask a question this evening, email us at asklanel@lanel.gov, and we'll get through as many questions as we can until about 7 o'clock. So let's start things off with a question which was submitted earlier. It was recently reported that an underground plume of chromium had spread through groundwater from the lab to Pueblo de San Ildefonso land. How did the chromium make it into the water, and what is the lab doing to fix the issue?
So the chromium that's in question here was something that was used widely, actually all over the country, all over the world, in the 50s and 60s before the environmental impacts were really fully understood as a corrosion inhibitor in pipes. And at the lab, it was used in the cooling towers in Technical Area 3 for our power plant. In fact, probably any cooling tower anywhere in the country that was running during that time would have been using chromium as a corrosion inhibitor. The water from the cooling towers was then released into Sandia Canyon, and that went up until 1972 when it was recognized that this wasn't a good idea, and it was stopped. I think one of the differences between Los Alamos and most other places in the country where this chromium was used in this way is we're a highly monitored site. So in 2004, the chromium plume was discovered in the regional aquifer because we do that very intense monitoring of the surrounding areas in the lab to make sure that there's nothing that we don't know about. And so in that same year, the DOE and the lab began working with the New Mexico Environment Department to install a network of wells to monitor, as well as a treatment system to remove the chromium from the aquifer. In 2015, the Department of Energy's Office of Environmental Management stood up a program at Los Alamos to manage those legacy issues. So chromium, along with the other kind of legacy environmental issues, is something that's managed not actually by the lab and the NNSA, but by DOE's Environmental Management Program and their contractor N3B. And so they're the ones who are working with NMED, the New Mexico Environment Department, to develop a final remedy that will mitigate the plume. Really, our role at Los Alamos is not so much with those legacy issues, although we certainly want to help N3B to be successful in any way we can. It's really more about making sure that our current operations don't have the kind of impacts that lead to a future legacy problem. That's where our responsibility lies.
Great, thank you, Tom. Here's the next question that came in for you. You talked a little bit about the Genesis mission earlier. Can you talk a little bit more about the lab's role in supporting it?
Well, this is a really exciting new initiative on the part of the government. It's something that's been in the works really for several years. The labs collectively, all 17 DOE labs, have been holding workshops, looking at the opportunities to use artificial intelligence to actually basically increase the pace of scientific progress. And the goal of the Genesis mission is to essentially build a platform for science where artificial intelligence combined with the scientific tools that the labs have, like our high-performance computers for modeling and simulation, and our experimental facilities like the Lance Accelerator or DART, or the synchrotrons that exist at other DOE labs, the neutron sources, that sort of thing, and really set up a system where in a kind of closed loop we could be using artificial intelligence as a tool to assist scientists and engineers in coming up with hypotheses, testing them computationally and experimentally using these exquisite scientific instruments that we have. The goal is to double the productivity of, double the productivity of research investments by the country in 10 years. And in order to do that, we want to double the productivity of the investments in research in the Department of Energy within 5 years. And if you look, the country right now spends about 3.5% of its gross domestic product in research between industry and government. And it would be great if that went up to 7%, but realistically, that's not very likely. There are a lot of other demands on those funds. So instead, the objective is, can we get the equivalent scientific benefit of a 7% investment, but with that 3.5% investment? That's what we mean when we say doubling the productivity. And we've already seen examples with the Venado supercomputer where we've been first in our open science. We spent about a year looking at things like behavior of materials, understanding fracture in materials, understanding structural biology, using artificial intelligence to help us develop the molecules that could deliver a therapeutic isotope to a cancer cell with high specificity, so that when that undergoes radioactive decay, the decay products basically kill the cancer cell, but no surrounding tissue. And so those are examples of the sorts of things where AI, artificial intelligence, large language models that are not speaking the English language or the Spanish language, they're speaking the physics language or the chemistry language, can be really helpful.
Great. So Kirsten Lasky with the Los Alamos Daily Post has this question for you. How does LANL stack up against the rest of the world in terms of its advancement in artificial intelligence research?
Well, I think this is something we've been leaning into. It's not new to us. We've been doing versions of artificial intelligence, machine learning for quite some time. For over a decade, we've been publishing lots of papers applying those sorts of tools to things like seismology and understanding earthquakes, or predicting space weather that can disrupt satellite communications, that kind of thing. The thing that's changed recently, within the last 2 years or so, is the scale at which it's being done and the recognition that with very large volumes of data, you get much, much better capabilities. And so we've been leaning into that as well. And part of that was using our institutional resources to buy this Venato computer. We've made a lot of investments of our discretionary research funding, which is called laboratory-directed R&D. So I think we're actually pretty well situated. I've been fortunate to actually just in the last little while, I visited South Korea, Japan, and Europe. I was in Berlin not so long ago, talking to leaders from other institutions, and I think in general we're probably a bit ahead at Los Alamos and in the U.S. in general. I think the one exception is probably China, which has also been leaning in pretty hard on this front, also making investments at scale. And the scale that we're talking about is sufficiently large that for the most part, it's the U.S. and China that are making a lot of the big breakthroughs. It's through, in the case of the U.S., a lot of really massive private sector investments with companies like Google and OpenAI and Microsoft and so forth. In China, it's more sort of government-driven. Sort of hard to tell the difference sometimes between private and public sector in their system. Whereas in other countries, they're sort of watching but trying to figure out how do we get into this game given the scale at which you need to be operating. So I think we're well positioned, but it's very competitive. And it's going to take the kind of focus and investment that's embodied in this Genesis mission to really get to that goal of doubling the productivity of research.
Great, thank you. Here's our next question. The current congressional funding package, which ended the 43-day shutdown, only provides funding until January 30th, 2026. If Congress fails to pass a new spending bill to fund the government through the rest of the fiscal year, will the lab repeat the plans that were recently initiated in October and November?
Yeah, the continuing resolution that passed that gets us through to the end of January just basically pushed us along so that now the end of January is kind of like the end of September was previously. So obviously I'm hopeful that there will be a budget passed, at least an energy and water appropriations bill. That's the part that's most relevant to Los Alamos. There's 13 appropriations. Some of them, they did pass full year appropriations. I think there were 3 that passed as part of that continuing resolution. So those parts of the budget are kind of already taken care of, but energy and water isn't. There's other significant bills that aren't passed. So we'll see what happens in January. There is some indication that there's work being done to kind of get to that goal. If we have another lapse, then it'll look probably pretty similar to what we just experienced. Our piggy bank was refilled with a continuing resolution, so we'll have money on hand at the end of January that'll tide us over for a period of time, and hopefully, as we saw before, we had sufficient funds to make it through to the point where Congress was able to enact the continuing resolution. So. Hope we don't get there, but we've practiced, we went through it before, we made it through okay. I'm confident we can make it through okay again if we need to.
Oh, good. Well, thank you for that. This is the next one. Lenel recently produced its first W87-1 plutonium pit. What did you learn from that milestone, and how does it shape the path to full production?
Well, I think the importance of that was not so much that we made a pit. I mean, that is important. It will become part of the Sentinel ICBM component of the deterrent in the future. But the really important thing was that it validated all of the equipment and processes and training that are necessary to make a pit. And as you can imagine, something as high consequence as a nuclear weapon has very exacting requirements in terms of quality. And so until you've actually made it all the way through that formal process of validating that the product you've produced meets all those requirements, you don't know whether or not there's something that you might need to change. And so, for example, all this infrastructure work that we're doing, we now know that the equipment that we're planning to install is the right equipment that's capable of making those pits. And so it really nails down the scope of that very significant multi-billion-dollar infrastructure investment, and in fact has allowed us to sort of shift our emphasis. Up until achieving that first production unit, our priority was achieving the first production unit. And so what that meant was, in the kind of constrained space of the PF4 facility, which is very precious floor space and hotly contested between people who need to upgrade aging infrastructure, put in new glove boxes, manufacture pits. Up until first production unit, when push came to shove, priority went to production because we needed that validation. Now that we have it, the priority has shifted to the infrastructure. We've got to finish the infrastructure work in order to be able to get to rate production. We are charged with making a minimum of 30 pits per year, and that's going to require more copies of the same equipment that we use to make that first pit, but we need to have more of them in order to get that throughput.
Yeah. Well, here's another question that was submitted to Ask Lanel at lanel.gov earlier, and it is related to the one you just answered. As the lab ramps up production, how do you balance national security needs with long-term environmental and community stewardship?
Well, I would say it's sometimes almost a misconception that there's some sort of tension between production, the national security needs of production, and environmental stewardship or safety or security. The reality is, without environmental stewardship, safety, and security, we don't produce. If it's not safe, if the environment is at risk, we are shut down. And that means we're failing in our national security mission. So it's not that we have to sacrifice one against the other. The environmental stewardship, safety, and security are what enables us to meet our national security mission, because without that, we are sitting on our hands, reviewing our training procedures, and not getting any of that national security work done. So it's absolutely imperative that that's front and center every day.
Yeah, well, shifting gears a little bit to hiring, what's the lab's plan for Los Alamos County and its residents regarding impacts of additional hiring? The majority of positions currently posted are for on-site work, not hybrid or remote work. Does the lab have plans for creating more off-site locations to help alleviate accidents on already crowded streets and ongoing housing shortages?
Well, we do take advantage of hybrid and telework as much as we can, and that does alleviate some of that pressure. But a lot of the work that we do, that doesn't work. If you're doing hands-on experimental work, if you're doing maintenance of facilities, if you're making pits, that's not a work-from-home activity. Anything classified is not a work-from-home activity. It does have to be on site. Now, we have been, I think, able to take advantage of space off the hill, like this facility here, which is in Santa Fe, and that helps quite a bit. We've got in this Pacheco facility, there's about 300 sort of spots for people. We actually support much larger number because a lot of the spaces are set up as kind of hot bunks, if you will, so that people who are on a hybrid schedule can come here a couple days a week, meet with their colleagues, and then work from home other days. And so it's probably closer to 900 people who are supported out of this facility, and that's been extraordinarily helpful. We're also building more space on the lab site. We've got office buildings that are going up to help support the growth, and we've been investing a lot in transportation options so that it doesn't always have to be one car, one person every day. With buses, for example, we've got buses that are running from a number of locations to bring people directly in, and a bus with 40 people is 39 less vehicles on the road. so that helps as well. We've been building bike paths. So for people in LA County, I live in Santa Fe, so it'd be kind of a long bike ride, especially that last 2,000-foot climb from the river. But if you're in Los Alamos County, then that's definitely an option. And so, there's no single solution. It's really got to be a combination of all of these things. And I do think the stepped-up enforcement is helping as well. And there has been more housing that's been built. There's more rental housing in Los Alamos County, more housing in Santa Fe, particularly on the south side. And so, the developer community is responding to the fact that we've been growing, we're hiring people, we pay good salaries, they can pay rent, they can pay for mortgages. It takes time, and that's been a challenge. But I think it's less acute than it was a couple of years ago, certainly. I think the people, our pace of hiring has tapered, so it's not as rapid growth as we saw. I think the highest hiring year was 2023. We hired 2,300 people. We're not going to repeat that level of growth again. Things have leveled off. It's more modest, and I think it's easier to accommodate within our kind of communities.
Yeah. Well, here's a question that focuses on dynamic imaging. I recently read about dynamic imaging in an issue of the Lab's 1663 magazine. Can you explain the value that Lance brings to isotope production?
Okay, those are two different things.
Okay.
So Lance does both. So Lance is a proton accelerator. It's a little over 50 years old. It was originally built to do meson physics. It was called LAMP, the Los Alamos Meson Physics Facility, which was kind of fundamental low energy nuclear physics. But accelerators, it turns out, are very versatile things, and you can use them in lots of different ways, sometimes that weren't even anticipated. And both isotopes and the proton radiography, which is the dynamic imaging that we do, were things that weren't really in the original conception of the LAMP facility, but creative people figured out ways to use those proton beams that Lance makes. And in the case of isotope production, we take a portion of our beam at relatively low energies. It's about 10% of the acceleration, so it's close to the front end of the accelerator, and deliver it to a target where it produces isotopes that, in fact, one example is the thing I mentioned we're using AI for, because the isotopes that we make are what are called alpha emitters. And an alpha emitter is something that undergoes radioactive decay by basically emitting a helium nucleus, which is called an alpha particle. And the alpha particles have the property that they're heavy. In comparison to, say, a neutron or a proton or a gamma ray, which is the other sort of forms of radioactive decay. And because they're heavy, they do a lot of damage to tissue. And that's bad if it's healthy tissue, but if it's a cancer cell, it can really effectively kill a cancer cell, and it's got very short range. So when that alpha particle comes out, it doesn't travel very far. So if you can get a chemical that takes the actinium-225, would be the isotope in this case, to the cancer cell, and then it undergoes radioactive decay. It's like a smart bomb for cancer. And we can make that isotope at our Lance facility at something called IPF, the isotope production facility. The dynamic imaging is different. There we use the full accelerator, and the protons that come out are like a strobe light. A bunch of short pulses of protons. And so what we can do is shine that strobe light on something that we want to study and make a series of movies. If you've ever seen the example where you have a strobe light and people are moving around, it looks like a stop motion video.
Yes.
We can do that stop motion video of something that's happening very, very fast. On the time scale of the individual micropulses in the beam. What would be that fast? Well, one of the things we care about that moves that fast is the propagation of high explosives. And so we can actually image that in this sort of strobe-like fashion with our proton accelerator. And that's what we call dynamic imaging. It's not like a passive chest x-ray where you see, oh, there's a broken rib. It's actually looking at a series of images that's making a movie so that you can see how things are moving deep inside, some functioning system.
Okay, thank you. Here's another one. We're going to move into a little bit of money talk here. How will the lab respond to the recent GRT increase, and how will future hiring and programmatic activity be affected?
Well, we contribute to both the state and Los Alamos County, where we're located, quite a bit in terms of the gross receipts tax. I think last year it was about $140 million that we paid in gross receipts tax. That number has gone up considerably as the lab budget has grown. When I first got here in 2018, it was, I can't remember exactly, it might have been like 90 million, something like that. So it's gone up quite a lot. And that meant that the revenue to both Los Alamos County and the state have gone up quite a lot. I think the Los Alamos County tax increase, which I don't often inject myself into political things, but I just felt like I ought to say something about this. To be honest, it's not helpful. We don't get additional funding from the federal government to cover that. So what it means is it has to come out of our hide. We only do two things with the money we have. We buy stuff and we pay people. So if we don't get an increase in our funding and the taxes go up, we buy less stuff and pay fewer people. It's that simple. And I think it's about $13 million is the impact. And so, you can figure out how many jobs there it is. That's just payroll. I think the pace of growth has leveled off as the lab budget has leveled off. And so I guess that's probably what's motivating the desire to look for alternative sources of revenue. But, I know at the lab when our growth leveled off, what we did was we looked really hard to see how can we do things more efficiently so that we don't rely on ever increasing funding. And we looked pretty hard at our indirect budgets. We made reductions in those indirect budgets to accommodate the fact that the rapid growth we'd experienced had been sort of tapering off. And we were able to do that, and we didn't increase our overhead rates, which are our internal versions of taxes. So, these are not easy things. But I think we've been fortunate that the budgets went up as much as they did. And it looks like they may be going up again based on the budget request for 2026. But, it's always a little hard to project. Every year is a new appropriation. And as we've seen with things like the shutdown, that slows down our spending, which slows down the payment of gross receipts tax. But hopefully we're back on track and we'll get a budget for this year that will be up again.
Yeah. And once we get into that budget, this question is related. What new contracts or programs should small businesses look for in 2026, and how will LANL lower barriers for new local vendors?
Well, that mentor protege program that I mentioned is one way we do that. It's a small, obviously 2 new mentor proteges. It's a small number of companies involved, but it's one of the mechanisms. The other thing that we do is we do try and do a lot of outreach. We host events, at places like the Buffalo Thunder and so on, where we'll bring in small businesses to tell them about, our projections of where do we see needs in the future. Now, our crystal ball is not perfect because, they are dependent on federal appropriations, but we try as best we can to sort of say, these are the areas where we have needs. And, obviously we're still in the middle of a lot of infrastructure work. So that's one of the key areas, so that companies can understand, what are the opportunities that are going to become available, and position themselves. And I think sometimes those events are good also because they're opportunities for companies to identify partners, because sometimes you might not have the whole solution, but you might have a piece of it. And so, a lot of a lot of the awards that we make are to sort of joint ventures and partnerships between small businesses and large businesses and so forth. And sometimes those events can be good matchmaking opportunities for that sort of thing as well.
Yeah, and so another question related to hiring, this time from a job seeker. I don't have a master's or doctorate in science. What kinds of jobs would be available to me at the lab, and how do I learn more about those opportunities?
Jobs.lanel.gov.
Okay. So it's not just science that
in fact, only about 25% of our staff are PhD scientists and engineers. The other 75%, it's just about anything you can imagine. There's a broad range of skills that are needed to build our infrastructure, operate our infrastructure, run the business systems, and human resources, finance, communications.
Yes, thank you.
So there's, I would say there's very few to no jobs for people who don't have some form of higher education. Now, that doesn't mean it's a PhD. We've been working with the New Mexico building trades in programs in high schools that lead to apprenticeships that get you the skills you need for those craft jobs, which are very important and critical to our needs. Lot of work that may require kind of 2-year associate's degrees from community colleges, and we've been working with Santa Fe Community College and UNMLA and Northern on some of those programs. We also have programs where people who have 2-year associate's degrees can, while they're working at the lab, turn that into a 4-year engineering undergraduate degree. And we do hire people at the master's and the PhD level as well, but it's actually a smaller fraction of our workforce that are in those areas. And there's almost, I think anyone who's interested in the national security of the mission of the lab and has some sort of skill, some kind of higher educational attainment, can probably find a way they can contribute.
Yeah, so go to jobs@lanel.gov, right?
Jobs.lanel.gov.
Jobs.lanel.gov if you are that job seeker who sent that question in. So here's another question that just came in. Lanel is the perfect place for non-weapon nuclear activities that have high payoff, but also more risk of failure. This should include innovations in fission power plants, nuclear fusion, and hybrid fission fusion, where spent fission fuel is burned in fusion plants. The last would increase energy production from that spent fuel, reduce the requirements for fusion, and reduce radioactive waste. Does Lanel intend to scale up these activities?
Well, I mean, we already are. Obviously, this is one of the areas that's been really emphasized by the new administration. And we have a number of activities that are supporting that, drawing on the kind of capabilities that we have as a consequence of our national security missions. So, the reason we have competencies in fission and fusion is because that's our day job in deterrence. But it is important to, identify those areas where we can contribute to meeting energy goals in ways that are base load capacity, so we don't have to worry about intermittency. They're non-emitting, and the real challenge is to get some of these technologies over the first of a kind hurdle. And so just to give a couple of examples of things that we're doing, and a lot of this is in partnership with industry. There's a thing called a CRADA, Cooperative Research and Development Agreement, that we've signed with some of the fusion startup companies. And that gives them a mechanism where they can, bring their private capital to the lab to help them solve a problem they have that we may have people or facilities that are really kind of unique. So that's one mechanism. We have another project on fission with a company called Kairos, which has built a manufacturing facility in Albuquerque, just south of Kirtland Air Force Base, where they're building components for a test reactor that they're building in Oak Ridge. And one of the challenges that they have is there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem associated with the fact that in order to get a license to build a commercial reactor, they have to build a prototype that they need fuel for, but there's no business case for building a fuel facility if you don't have a licensed reactor. So how do you solve that problem? Well, it turns out the way they've decided to solve that problem is we're going to help them manufacture the fuel for their test reactor so they can prove it out, and then they'll do that as a commercial activity. We're not in the fuel fabrication business as a commercial activity, but in this early development phase, it's something that we can do because we know how to work with, in this case, what's called HALEU, which is high assay, low enriched uranium. And they've got a facility in Albuquerque where they can do all the testing with surrogate materials, but they can't work with the uranium there. Well, we know how to do that. So that's another example of the sort of thing that we can do to help make this a reality.
Yeah, well, we're getting close to the top of the hour, and so this is going to be our final question for the evening. I recently read something about the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. It must be really interesting to work in a place so steeped in history. Looking into the future, what do you think people will be remembering about Los Alamos in 80 years?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, certainly I think the opportunity we have with this Genesis mission to really transform the way we do science is pretty substantial, because if you think about the way that science progresses, it's a bit of a feedback machine. Breakthroughs in one area can lead to new capabilities that enable breakthroughs in another area. So, one thing builds upon another. It's kind of like the magic of compound interest. And the magic of compound interest is it results in exponential growth. And I think the opportunity to change the productivity, change the pace of scientific research over 80 years has huge potential. If you think how much science has transformed our society since 1940,
yes.
I think artificial intelligence has the potential to magnify that. So as different as the world is compared to what it was in 1943 in terms of the improvements in healthcare and our standard of living and our communications tools and transportation, and it's hard to pick an area of human activity that's not very, very different from what it was 80 years ago. And that was without AI. So now with artificial intelligence, I think the lab has the opportunity to help develop this platform that's going to allow us to solve much harder problems. And there are still many unsolved problems, as much progress as we've made. There are diseases that we don't understand. There are materials that don't perform as well as we need them to. There's a whole host of problems. And solve not only more difficult problems, but solve them more quickly and more cost effectively. So that's a big deal. And I think just as we were seen as sort of planting the seeds for computing, with work that was done. The very first computers, some of the very first computers were made in our electronic shops. We made them. And then when companies started making them, we would buy the first one. Sometimes Livermore got the first one, but usually we would get the first one. And now computing is a massive transformational industry. The US government, the labs are a very small part of it, but at the beginning we drove it. And I think artificial intelligence has that same potential.
Great. Well, thank you, Thom, for fielding those questions from the community this evening. We are out of time right now. We will be posting the recording of tonight's session on our website, so be sure to visit lanl.gov in the coming days to see that recording. Many thanks to our fellow community partners for participating tonight and continuing this important open dialogue. On behalf of Thom, Los Alamos National Laboratory, and the community, thank you and have a good night.